Hi, welcome everybody. We're so glad you could make it today. Thanks for joining us on some practical tips from leading your team from afar. So my name's Nicki Bellington. I'm the head of remote talent programs here at Atlassian, and I'm joined by Michael Pryor, who's the co-founder and head of Trello here at Atlassian as well. So before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping tips for you guys. So you'll see on your right-hand screen, there's a question box. We'd love to hear from you. We want to hear any questions you have, as well as any challenges that you might be having, technical challenges. Drop us a note in there and someone can help you out if you need it. So let's get started. So Michael, lots has changed in the past couple of weeks. We know there's some teams and managers that have found themselves working remotely that wouldn't have been working remotely otherwise. It's caused a lot of swirl. So you've been a remote leader for quite some time. Can you maybe just talk to us a little bit about what's one of the main differences in leading a team remotely compared to in the office?
Sure. Before I get to that, first thing I'd say is like this style of working remotely is not quite exactly working remotely under normal circumstances. You know, I think like a lot of the things that we're dealing with right now are not normal. Like the kids are home all day, for example,
Right.
or your stress levels are super high. And but I think pieces of what we talk about when we try to set teams up to be successful as a remote team apply here as well. So thinking about your setup, your environment, what are the rituals and practices that you have. The biggest thing that changed, I think, and always changes when you shift to a more remote way of working, is the communication channel. And I think that when you're working remotely, the most important thing is to over communicate, because what happens is a lot of the communication that happens in person now is going through different mediums. So mostly probably like email or Slack, right? And Microsoft Teams or whatever your chat program is. And what happens there is you lose a lot of context, or you forget all the conversations that you have over lunch or when you go to get a coffee. And there's a lot of that emotional connection that you have from just talking to people that kind of isn't there anymore. And so the way to combat that, though, is to be over communicative, which feels a little bit awkward at first. You're trying to tell people things that you might not normally say if you were there in the office, but you forget that there's all these cues that you get from being there in the office. So for example, somebody walks by your office, they can tell visually whether you're free or not, right? And then now that we're all remote and we're separated, like you can't see that anymore. So you might have to tell people when you're free, when you're not. And you also have to remember that the communication that you're having is it's not always evident who's listening, right? So you're talking in a chat room and there's a lot of people reading it, whereas in the office you might be having a conversation and you can kind of see who can hear it. And also that can tend to lead to you have to remember to, what do we say, you change the medium, not the message. So sometimes you can end up in a conversation where you can start to feel a little bit of tension, and we say immediately, like, you should remember to realize that means, you know, switch to Zoom or something, like get out of Slack, switch to Zoom, right? Instead of to at least layer on some of that more emotional context, the ability to be human and see people's faces and the tone of voice and all those things that we normally use in person.
Yeah, that's great. I've heard one leader call it escalate to face, which I always liked, right? Yeah, that's great. So, you know, I think one thing that some leaders struggle with, especially if they're used to more in person, is how do you know if your team is actually working? Like, how do you know that they're being productive? Like, what does that look like? How is it different?
Yeah, that's a common question. I think I noticed, I saw an article somewhere how when everyone shifted to remote working recently because of the pandemic, that sales of sort of boss spyware, where you can see what your employees are doing, like, sales of that software like skyrocketed, right? Like there's this immediate like lack of trust, I think.
Sure.
Which is funny because I think in some ways it makes you realize how how inaccurate our normal modes of like understanding of people are working are. Like if you just see somebody and they're there at 6 a.m. till 8 p.m. Like what a hard worker, right? Like it's a shortcut. And what it allows us to do as managers is essentially to measure just output, like the hours that somebody's at the office, instead of measuring their outcome. And I think regardless of remote working or not, it's actually really good to force yourself to measure the outcomes and to measure what is the work that's happening, where is that happening. And I think part of it being part of Atlassian, using our tools and all those things, like the way that we work openly and we put things in Confluence, we're already spread out throughout the world. And so I think we already adopt a lot of those processes because we sort of have to. But there's a transparency and a trust that go hand in hand to those things. So it's like if we're working, and you go back to the earlier thing that I was talking about, over communicating, it's how are you making sure to produce the information, the assets, and then share them so that other people can read them asynchronously, right? Slack is not actually a measure of work. And I remember seeing this when Slack people started first using it, and like managers were kind of frustrated a little bit because people were spending all this time in Slack. And there's sort of two sides to that, which is it is communication, but it's not work. It's why when people use Slack, they still use Jira or they use Trello or these other tools. So I think that you want to focus on making sure that you're doing your work openly, that you're doing it in a way that can be shared with people when you're not there. If you're doing a Zoom, even just record it, right? Actually, it's an advantage in these cases if you're relying on the technology, because it allows you to distribute these conversations in a way that, if you're of a meeting and you're talking about something, the only people that are going to see that meeting are the people that are in the room. Whereas if you have a Zoom now, you can record it and share it with people later, and they can watch it in 1.5 speed and actually take it in much quicker. So there's a lot of advantages to this too.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it kind of goes back to your comment about over communicating, right? Like you might be seeing that someone's working on something, and now you're able to share that, right? Like, hey team, here's a Trello board I'm working on, or here's a Confluence page. So it is a little bit of replicating some of that stuff in person remotely, right? Whether that's even the Slack statuses of, hey team, I'm doing deep work, or hey team, I went for a walk, or out to lunch. So you're kind of changing that up a little bit. Yeah, I like that. But you're right, it can feel a little bit tough at first, but I think being transparent and communicating is important. So kind of in that same vein, how do you, what tips do you have for managers in setting expectations during this time, and just for remote teams in general? Is it different than in office, or how's it changed for you and your teams?
Yeah, and I think we would talk about this a little bit in our remote work guide we Trello put a remote work guide out there and we published it, and we sort of mentioned this, but I think it's even more important, especially under the pandemic, and that's to align with the rest of the people that you're working with on what the ground rules are. Like, when am I going to be available? When am I not available? If you DM me on the weekend, am I going to respond to that or not? So, and there's two sides to that. One is aligning with the people that you work with. So as a team or your managers, and expressing like, hey, I'd like to work in the mornings because I have to homeschool in the afternoons, right?
Exactly.
So it's like, which it's like now there's a lot more constraints on our life because we have to take on these additional jobs as teacher, cleaner, whatever. Like there's
caretaker.
So it helps. I've seen people on our teams to just say like, here's my schedule. Like I'm going to be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. From 9 to 2, and if you DM me outside of that, I'll get to it when I get back to work and things like that. That's good practice regardless. It's just even more important now because I think there's an assumption normally during remote work that you're like, oh, I'm awake and working, and then this person isn't, or is as well.
Right.
But because of time zones, that may or may not be true. So the Trello team, we always tried to align on, I think it was like 11 to 4 p.m. Eastern or 11 to 3 p.m. Eastern was the 4 hours of the day that we could expect that everyone would be online during that time synchronously.
Core time.
But the general gist is like, this is one of those things that you have to force yourself to over communicate again, but establish the ground rules and tell people what they are. When can you be reached? When can you not be reached? Like those sorts of things. And we do that normally when you go on leave or something like that. But like, this is one of those times where it makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that, like these ground rules, and it can be anything from just how decisions are made to what's expected of you, and like you said, statuses and times that you're working. And it feels so simple, but I feel like making an effort to write all that stuff down and agree and align on it really helps teams. I know that's something that my team's done, and it's been really productive just to know, we use Trello for this, we use Confluence for that, here are working hours, etc.
Right.
So it's great. So kind of, in addition to setting expectations, what are some practical ways that you're kind of seeing how your team is doing during this time? I feel like, it's important that we're checking in on our folks. What's going on for you there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you do one-on-ones normally, regardless if they're in person and that. I think that the cadence of how often you might want to do those things might be a little bit higher, because I think it's just harder to really understand what everyone's going through. And right now it's especially important to understand this. So one of the things that we've been doing is telling all the managers, like check in on people, because you can kind of see if somebody's doing fine when you see them in the office. Oh, I met them, we
had lunch.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's really easy to disappear when everyone's working remotely, because your only connection to these people might be through Slack, or you're only connecting to people that are, like your direct reports or people that you're working with. So where's the connections that are happening outside of that? How are people getting together? When is that, unless you make time for that, it's not going to happen. So I think it's, harder to see burnout right now.
Yes.
It's harder to see who's struggling. And even when you do the Zoom, that 15, 20 minutes that you do the one-on-one, is that going to be enough?
Yeah.
Because in person, you had so much more color on how people were doing. And now it's just much harder.
Yeah. And I think we've heard some of our managers talk about asking just questions around like how's your world, or, what's going on now, like kind of more, call them safe questions, right? That allow someone to detail as much or as little information as they want. And you never know what kind of information pops up through that. Because to your point earlier, you might be caretaker, teacher, and employee, or you might be the person who's working 16 hours a day because you're home by yourself, right? So you've got folks all across the spectrum.
Joff, my boss, he tells me all the time when we start the one-on-ones, he's like, on a scale, like, what's your number on like
I love that. Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what the number is. He's just sort of like, he knows what it is every week, so sort of can tell me if it's like down or up. I could be like, normally I'm a 3 or whatever it is, but if it's like goes up to 5 or goes into 1, it's relative how I'm doing. And so it's just sort of like a way to check in and get a quick pulse. Of course, the other thing is, my wife was saying recently how when you ask people how they're doing, like now the answer is like the best answer anyone can give is kind of like fine, like it's actually like if you're doing fine, it's actually like on the
positive spectrum. Right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So and I think that's exactly the point, is like be creative in the questions that you're asking to get to really kind of get that pulse on how your team is doing. I think that's really important. And so kind of connected to that, how are you continuing or creating, if you're a new manager, that social connection as a team remotely?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that there's a bunch of different things that we've done when we shifted more to remote work, and how we included the more remote workforce in the social connection. To go back to my early answer about how you're forming those connections amongst people, because when you shift to that remote work, most of your interaction is just directly who you're working with.
Right.
So, for example, one of the things that we did a long time ago is we had these meetings called Mr. Rogers, where we just paired people up into weekly meetings where you just took a random person, another random person, and you were like, here's your Zoom call for 30 minutes. It was super awkward when I first did that.
Yeah, like, hey.
yeah, like, hey, I don't know you. What's your name? Like, and it was actually awkward. So the iteration, we added more people into it, and then it was like 4 people. So you'd have people talking, because basically what you realize is you're trying to recreate just what would happen.
Sure. Meeting in the kitchen or something.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
It's not usually like you're like an interview scenario, right? There's like people around. Some people are talking. Some people are just, so we were trying to do more of that. The other thing that was a little bit difficult was like scheduling it. Then it became difficult to schedule. And that kind of stuff. So we were using the breakout rooms feature on Zoom after we had our town halls every month. So we do these town halls every month. We get all the Trello people together. It's like a Trello town hall in addition to Atlassian town hall. And then you'd use the breakout rooms to send people into rooms, and then you'd spend 15, 20 minutes just talking about whatever, right? And the point was to talk not about work necessarily, but just about other stuff, so that people could figure out who are the other people on the team, And that was really helpful. But it's interesting that dilemma of trying to do those things and having them feel
authentic.
Clunky, like they're a little bit like forced, but the truth is, if you don't do them, then the benefits that you get from those normal interactions, you just won't get that, and you won't realize it. You won't be like, oh, people don't generally hear. There's a guy that tells these amazing stories, and you come in, sit down at lunch, tell these amazing stories, and everyone on the team would just generally like enjoy that, and then you don't realize that those benefits are not happening. So it's like, how are we creating a team outside of just work, but what are we doing as a team? So to go back again to the other thing I said earlier, was just when we first started using Slack and you saw people complaining about how much people were in Slack all day, then again, when people are making those rooms and they're talking about social things like dogs or their kids, or TV, we have all these rooms, social NYC, social SF, like there's these social rooms, but even the sort of vertical rooms, it's just like an Elon Musk room, and there's all these
there's all kinds.
But those are really important, right? Because that stuff happens in person, right?
Absolutely.
Like it happens in person. So if you're a manager and you see this, you see people in these rooms, you're like, they should be working, not chatting. Like, I guess to some extent, maybe if you go into the office and somebody's in the kitchen all day long and everyone up. But the existence of those rooms and people's participation in them is actually like really good, because it forms a connection. It forms a common bond amongst everyone working. And so you have to go through all those practices and rituals that you do in person and figure out how you're going to best recreate them online. And you can't always do it perfectly, right? Like we used to have a beach day. We take all the Trello people to the beach down in New Jersey, and we get on a ferry in New York. They take us to New Jersey on a ferry, and take a bus then to this like beach. And it's like, you can't do that specific thing, but what was the point? Why did we do that? It was a break. It was like, let's take a break from work. We're all going to do a shared experience where we're not working, but we're kind of just like hanging out and having fun. So can we do something similar to that? Are there things that we can do online, or can everyone go off? Maybe they do it with their families, and we come back and we share that experience.
Pictures,
We have like a Trello board where we like, people would post the pictures where they did the day off with their families and what they did. So it's just it's sort of, you'd think I'd encourage people to really think hard about this, because I think it's probably something that people put in the lowest priority on the list of things that they have to worry about when they think about working remotely. But it has such an implication to all the other things that you do and how you work as a team, that and no one, the sort of practices of a company don't necessarily incorporate those team rituals and stuff,
right? Naturally, right?
It's not like you have to report that to, you know, your performance assessment or something. Like, it just doesn't fit into the normal way of doing business. And so but it creates connection, you know, it creates
engagement,
trust, and all those things that are so important to the way that people interact.
And I think what I'm hearing you say is that it requires intentionality, right? So whatever that looks like. I know for our team, we started doing some, it sounds simple, but just some online games, you know, like Pictionary and Categories and stuff. And it was so much fun, right? Or a virtual happy hour, or, but it requires scheduling that, connecting, following up. And so, but it's been a lot of fun.
You made me just think of another example, which was that our team, I mentioned before, we used to do a monthly town hall. And the town hall, because we got bigger and bigger, the Trello town hall ended up being much more of a presentation format. We were smaller, the town hall was more like two-way, like people would throw
ask questions.
You get over 100, and then it starts to just be like,
it's hard.
They're like, just tell me stuff.
Yeah.
But with all the COVID stuff happening, we realized, like, hey, there's so much happening, like every day, like stuff was happening, and we didn't want to wait a whole month. It was like, oh my God, a month is way too long. So we started doing mini town halls on Friday. So they were just going to be half an hour, and we started doing them, and people have loved it. And it's way more unscripted. We're totally unprepared, but it's much more honest and open. It's like, last week I was telling people I had a tough time with some negative press that Trello got and how it affected me personally, and just like reading that. And like some people reached out and said that was really helpful to see that, because you're in your house, you might be having the same thing. Like, where's the connection to other people and what they're going through? And so it was both the cadence of checking in and sort of changing our ritual to fit the times, you know, and how we did that in sort of the content. It wasn't, oh, this is a scripted town hall. This is more like, just come together, Q&A type of, just gonna throw things out there. So
and I think you're hitting on another thing that's probably the undercurrent of all these tips, is, especially given this time, is empathy, right? And to some extent being vulnerable, or setting the tone as a leader, right? Like, I love that example of, hey, this was hard for me this week, right? So people know that not only are you a human with feelings and you're dealing with stuff, but it provides that foundation as a team. I think that's so important. That's great.
Agree.
So before we kind of wrap up, any other tips or anything else that you want to leave folks with?
You should definitely set a Zoom background. And here's why. So most people think you're just doing it for fun. And I actually realized it's because then you don't have to worry about your messy room behind you, because no one can see it anymore. Or the random person coming in.
That's right. Totally. I know, right? You'll never know what's behind here, Michael. Just like I won't know what's behind you. Awesome. Well, so just as a quick recap, everybody, thanks for joining. So we talked about some tips, talked about over communicating, working open, establishing some really good ground rules for your team, checking in on your folks and their well-being, and then creating or continuing some good social rituals virtually. So we appreciate so much you taking the time to watch, and this concludes the presentation part of this session. So we'll jump into our Q&A next. Thanks so much.